How many of you went to the party last night? Did you have fun? Good food, good times? Good. How many of you lost to me in a drunken horse race? Not enough. So we got a lot more events and talks and everything today. Obviously, all the villages are open, so go learn how to hardware hack, lockpick, chill out, CTF, and do the Raise Me Career Village. Events for later today after this talk at 11 o'clock in the Hardware Hacking Village is the HeboCon Robot Battle. At lunch in the Lockpicking Village, that's 12 o'clock, is Intro to Lockpicking. At 2 p.m. in the Lockpicking Village is the Threat Hunting CTF, which is like a blue team CTF. And at roughly between 3 and 4, most of the contests close. So if you're doing a contest, ask the contest organizers in their respective rooms what time you need to be done by. We're just doing some technical setup for the first talk here, and as soon as that's good to go, then we will start this next talk. Thank you for your patience. All right, without further ado, coming up next is Amber Welch with Data Access Rights Exploits Under New Privacy Laws.
Well, thank you everyone for waking up early for this. I know that that's quite a feat when you've had an open bar the night before, but thank you so much to the organizers for doing that. So today we're going to be talking about privacy laws and all of the evil things that you can do with them. So my name is Amber Welch. I work as a privacy program assessor, i.e. external auditor for companies who need to have some kind of attestation showing that they're in compliance with certain laws, such as the GDPR. I work with startups, old school companies, big enterprises, large Bay Area names that you would all recognize. I've seen both wonderful things in privacy and some very terrifying things. But the moral of the story is that I read privacy laws so that you don't have to. So today we'll talk about data subject requests, also known as data subject access requests sometimes, and we'll be calling these DSRs for the sake of ease. We'll also talk about the exploits and then the defense strategies that organizations can use against these exploits. So we'll just go over the basic concepts of what these are first. So we're living in a global privacy era now. There are international privacy laws for the first time. The GDPR really broke into a new territorial scope in a way that we had never seen before. They're using sanctions to actually apply their law across their own borders. This is something we've never really seen before, and it changed a lot of how organizations that have personal data have to operate. So we see this with the US, the EU, CCPA is the new California law, the APEC region, Canada's been on board with access laws for a long time with PAPETA. But most access laws are similar under privacy in every organization or in every country. So there are 4 primary rights that you want to know about when you're thinking about doing potential exploits. The right of access is the right for anybody to request access to the information that a company has on them. That's just being able to view it and potentially download it. There's also the right to modification or rectification. This can be used as a sort of proxy for access if you can't get full access to the data. There's also the right of erasure, which would be potentially useful if you just wanted to make somebody's life really miserable, but you wouldn't necessarily get the information. It's just the right to be forgotten is what it's often known as. There's also the right of portability. This is getting an export of your data in a machine-readable format that can be consumed by that company's competitor. So if Facebook ever had a successful competitor, you could just port your data over to them, in theory. So there are some new challenges that have been coming up with this redefinition of privacy laws. We now have privacy laws that cover metadata and indirect identifiers. When most people think of PII, they just think of things like names, address, stuff that a human can look at and say, yep, that's a person's data. So this isn't the case anymore. If you have an IP address that's associated with your household, it's personal data. If you have, under the California law, device data that's associated with your household, that is also personal information. So this changes things in IoT, vehicle data, and things like facial recognition, publicly accessible or publicly gathered information about a person. There's also a new concept of linkable data. So data that's not currently associated with a person but could potentially be still needs to be protected as personal data. So this really changes a lot of what you can potentially request and the ways that you can make demands of companies to get your personal information. You can claim that something is personal information even if the company isn't aware of it, just because they're still responsible for it. There's also a new concept of controllers without control. Under privacy laws, they call data controllers the organization that owns the data and is responsible for deciding how it's processed and the protections applied to it, who can access it, things like that. So there's a really interesting case recently in the EU about this guy who successfully sued Google Spain because he wanted some information about himself removed from the search results and the indexing. So Google Spain's position was, that's not our problem, we're just a search engine, what do you really expect us to do about it? But the EU said, you know, deal with it, you have that data, and this is his right. So you're now living in a world where even if an organization never meant to have information on you, they still have to provide all of these rights to you. I think this is going to be especially interesting in facial recognition, and it's probably the best way that we would be able to fight against abusive or invasive facial recognition technology in public. So what you need to remember now is that everything can be PII. Everything can be personal data. Just because something isn't currently personal data doesn't mean that it isn't potentially personal data if it's combined with another data set in the future. So what have companies done to deal with this? Mostly panic. Yesterday was 1 year from the day that the GDPR went live. Does anybody remember all of the privacy policy emails that swarmed into your inbox? And you got a nice handy checkoff list of everyone to unsubscribe from? So companies, they got scared of the potential fines. They heard these huge fines coming out of the EU, and their response was just to panic, provide all of the data when asked for it, outsource to legal firms, and generally they feared non-compliance with the law more than they feared the breach of one person's data. So even though a malicious DSR, which was successful, would technically be a reportable data breach, companies don't think that way. They're just scared of having complaints. So generally, internally in companies, ID processes for data subject requests are maybe a policy statement that just says something like, identify the data subject. Usually there is no procedure or actual standard, and never any training of the people who would be doing it, no tabletops or anything. There's also two primary ways of completing a DSR. There's the self-service kind of option where you would go into your account, an authenticated account, click a button, and get all of your information. This is similar to the Facebook download option where it would be really expensive for them to pay people to do this. You can also do a manual version where they just provide an email address, like in the public privacy policy, and you can send them an email and they'll go back and panic a little bit and then try to respond to it. There are a few organizations that have done some kind of hybrid approaches where you can initiate the process in your account, but then there's still some manual review that it goes through and maybe some manual processing before that data is provided to you. So we'll look at Twitter later as an example of this manual process. So the fun stuff, the stuff that you're all here for, what terrible things can you do with this? It turns out a lot of terrible things. We'll start with one of my favorites, legal DDoS. This is something that I think so far has happened unintentionally, but is very likely to be more actively abused as people become aware of this. So usually this would be a case where maybe an educational campaign or a protest group would do a large public push to tell everyone, hey, this company is bad, we don't like what they're doing with their data, or we just want to make things difficult for them. Go and ask for all of your information. So once that happens to that company, they're potentially flooded with a huge swarm of people asking for these requests. And they can be quite difficult to process and take a huge number of both technical and legal people to do well. So this could be very expensive and would potentially lead to companies having to outsource some of this processing so that they would be able to complete those requests in time. This, as an attacker, is really beneficial because if you notice that this kind of campaign is happening legitimately, it's a really good time for an attacker to come in and sort of tag on, because you can swarm them with boilerplate text, which is something you would never be able to do in social engineering otherwise. But when somebody else has already provided this boilerplate request, then you can submit hundreds if you want, and no one's really going to pick up on that. This is also very distracting for security and legal teams. So if you notice that this was happening to a company, you could attack them probably in other ways, and they would be very busy. This is the kind of attack that would probably be most effective against an organization that had an otherwise very strong privacy program, where you maybe wouldn't have a lot of other options. This is also going to happen very naturally after any data breach that is publicly notified. So I think it was yesterday, Canva had a very large data breach. So I imagine at this point, they're probably getting data subject requests from people who see that their information was included and are very, very unhappy and would like to know what information that company has on them. So this is damaging because these requests can be extremely expensive. The average UK DSR costs £145. And this man had one DSR that against a midwifery clinic that ended up costing the NHS £140,000 to process because they outsourced it to a very expensive legal firm. So as a kind of simple example of this, what would you do to sort of DDoS a company through a data subject request? So I noticed that Twitter believes that I'm a man. I can't imagine why. I never told them that I was, but that's their determination based on my activity. So I might as well ask them why. So there's a DPO portal that you can go in and send a request, and this is the response that they sent me after about 2 weeks. So they paid a lawyer to respond to my request. It was a simple question: why do you think I'm a man, and what are the effects of this determination? And this is the outcome. I also have the right to continue this conversation, so I could just keep asking until they decide that it's abusive. The GDPR says that they can't charge a fee until DSRs are considered abusive or repetitive. It's very difficult to know when that might be, so you could really run up quite a legal bill for a company before they were able to say, all right, that's enough, we're done with this, this is genuinely abusive now. So we could all go and ask Twitter why they think that you are whatever gender they've decided for you. A couple of other things that you can do with DSRs that are, not the intended use. Guerrilla marketing. There are a couple of privacy vendors that are a little unscrupulous who decided to pester companies by putting out fake DSRs and saying, "Gosh, this is really annoying, isn't it? Wouldn't it be great if somebody came and did this for you?" There's also competitor research, which is, privacy consultants are really expensive, so we can just go and ask, another company with a similar model what they're doing and then copy their method. Disgruntled employees are pretty frequently using these to get back at a company if they've been fired or they have a beef with them. And especially lawyers who are working in employment law are using DSRs as free e-discovery because they can just submit the request and the company has to provide all of that information to them. The most disturbing reports that I've seen about malicious DSRs, though, are intimate partner violence and stalking or harassment of domestic partners. If you know a lot about a person, you can very easily pretend to be them and get all of the information from, say, messages or location data images. These things can be very damaging when you are looking at a situation with intimate partner violence. So phishing is probably the biggest area where this is fun, exploitable, potentially something that you could add to a pen test or a red team. There are a few different tactics that you would be able to deploy here. The GDPR says that you have to process DSRs verbally if somebody calls you. So you know what that means. You get to talk to tier 1 support. And that's what we all want to do when you're phishing, right? Because they tend to be, maybe new. Not quite as highly educated on security practices, perhaps, or identity methods for verifying a person. You can also ask to speak with the privacy officer directly, and you can continue to bother them with status updates about your pending request. So this gives you the opportunity to learn a lot about what's going on inside the company. You can call up and say, oh, I spoke to John about this. Oh, who's John? Isn't that your privacy officer or your security officer? So you get the opportunity to learn quite a lot about how that company works internally. There's security, legal, privacy, compliance teams. And potentially their IT teams as well. You can also escalate to family names. If you were able to submit a malicious request and you also knew that person was married, you would probably be able to get additional information on another person who is maybe a child or a spouse. Same thing with escalating to higher value data. Some organizations have done a good job of choosing risk-based identification processes where you can get low-risk information fairly easily. But then from there, once you've been vetted, they might not go on and ask for more information to identify you if you ask for higher sensitivity data. So you can kind of escalate your way through the system. You can also use common names. So how many of you would say that you have a relatively common name? Okay, I have a super common name. I have maybe 5 people who send emails to my Gmail address, right? Because they don't know maybe that adding a period doesn't change the email address. My favorite one is the woman in London who is much more successful than me, has a PhD, and is a volunteer for high school science fairs. And I know where she lives because I get the tube updates for her. I get people's photos as well. So many of you have probably had this experience, right, where you've gotten information that was meant for another person on accident. The thing with DSRs is that you're able to deploy that same mistake on purpose. If you have access to maybe a passport or a photo ID of someone who has a common name, then you can just kind of throw that out there and see what you get back for information through this DSR process. This is especially helpful in the US because a lot of companies still incorrectly believe that the GDPR applies to EU citizens, which it doesn't, but a lot of companies don't know any better. So if you approach them and they don't generally deal with EU data, but you say that you're an EU citizen, they'll probably just give you the information because they don't really know and they're scared of getting fined by some foreign country. So a lot of organizations, including Google, used to use just a passport to verify identity. But in cases where you don't already have the passport number, what does that really tell you other than that somebody was able to get a hold of the passport information for someone? I mean, passports get stolen. This isn't really information that's highly sensitive or confidential anymore. So what can you do with phishing? You can confirm profile data if you have a guess about somebody and you want to confirm that that's the correct person, or maybe match users across different data sets. If you're trying to link up 2 people in 2 different data sets, you would maybe be able to use information from one data set to confirm that person's identity in a different system. This would give you access to a broader, more rich data set on one individual. You can also learn new information about a person, especially if you're talking to someone verbally. You can kind of guess about information because people generally want to be helpful, right? This is how phishing works. You just ask them questions and they want to see you succeed in what you're trying to do, so they volunteer a lot of information. This is also really useful for spear phishing or CEO fraud, where you have a high value target and you maybe want to get information about someone from a different system, but you know that they have information in another company. You could start to get that information from the second company first, and then move on to the next one where you had the information you actually wanted, or the account you really wanted to break into. So if you're considering evaluating a company's privacy policy, there are a few different ways to do this because you don't really have a lot of visibility. You don't want to spend a lot of time wasting your efforts, because this can take a long time. So the privacy policy is your best bet here. If you see a privacy policy that's really old, outdated, or vague, then they probably haven't invested a lot of resources, especially not legal resources, in their privacy team, and they're probably going to be very caught off guard if you try this kind of attack with them, especially if they don't have any named privacy or security officer. There's an organization called pribot.org that will generate alluvial diagrams that you see here, and they will kind of parse out what contents are in a privacy policy. So you can see the weak one doesn't really have a lot of information. It ends in generally unspecified choices. And the strong privacy policy here has a lot of information about your rights, your choices, and what's being done with the data. So you wouldn't necessarily want to attack that strong privacy policy. So if you're looking for a weak target, there are a few profiles that are pretty common. Any kind of organization that deals with a lot of indirect identifiers and metadata, but doesn't necessarily have accounts. The CCPA says that you can't reject a DSR just because that person doesn't have an account with you. You can also attack international charities because they tend to have a lot of compliance obligations to many different countries, so their low budget doesn't go very far in getting them a lot of protection against this kind of attack, since they really need to know the law inside and out. Social media startups also tend to be a little weak on privacy protections. They tend to want to move fast and break things instead of worrying about the data that they're collecting. They also tend to collect more data than necessary because they haven't really decided how to monetize what they're doing yet. Small and medium businesses with minimal regulation are also a big target. So hotels, especially mid-size hotels, don't have a lot of regulation, but have a lot of personal information. So it would be a great target if you wanted to practice this. Also, apps that don't have 2FA but do automated DSR processing, clearly you would be able to get all of that information very quickly if you ever got into that account with a password or weak credential. So for example, Spotify rather infamously refuses to add 2FA to their account. So somebody had this kind of attack happen to them, which I found on Twitter recently. They had all of their information downloaded because the password was compromised. So going back to Twitter, I tried this just to see what happens if I actually go in and submit a DSR. So all you have to do is you go into the settings. I have 2FA on my account, but it doesn't prompt a second 2FA request. It does ask for your password, but if we're working in a situation where the password is compromised or the session is already authenticated, then you're not really going to have a lot of protection. So you click this button that says request data. When that happens, it just sends a request internally. It doesn't have any kind of UI banner on the account letting you know that this has been done. It doesn't send an email to my email address saying somebody has submitted a request. It just goes off and does its thing. So about an hour later, I get this email, which seems like very bad advice. If you notice at that last line, if you didn't request this information, you can ignore this email. I did let Twitter know that this was a problem. They're still working on figuring out a solution. So I go back into my account, and here's the button. I click download. Again, there's no email notification that this actually happened. It never says that the data was downloaded. The only notice a user would get is the email telling them to ignore this. So here's all of the information that I'm able to get. This is for the entirety of your Twitter history. So you would have basically everything, all media, all messages, and a lot of metadata. So there's very little reason for a person not to try to do this because DSRs used to be you could fine somebody, or no, I shouldn't say fine, you could charge a fee of 10 pounds, but you're no longer allowed to do that. So it's completely free for someone to try to do these DSRs as often as they want. And usually companies have provided these rights to everyone globally, because they aren't just trying to decide which person is in the scope of the law. So whenever a new privacy law comes out in a geographical territory that has a global impact, then basically everybody gets these rights. We don't tend to think about it a lot in the US because this is completely new to us. So there's not a lot of concern about the potential malicious attacks like these. So over 40 years ago, academics already knew that this was going to be a problem. The Lindop Committee said subject access rights would probably increase the incidence of personal records being accidentally or deliberately open to third parties. And in those 40 years, we have, as technical people, made absolutely no progress on thinking about this, or even really talking about it. How many of you knew that this was a potential attack before today? So a few of you do, yeah. It's not very common though, and part of the reason for that is because the privacy profession hasn't done a very good job of enlisting the help of security people and developers. They don't tend to share this information. This is usually handled by legal teams, and at most, the IT teams and security teams only hear about this if they need a particular question answered. They don't really get the big picture. So now that you do know about this, what are some things you guys can do to get involved if this is happening in your company? So the common DSR process is usually that you get a generic request in an email inbox, and some support person or maybe a legal or compliance person will decide whether or not it's valid, and then if it's high risk or requires some manual processing, we'll send it to IT or legal and get the right approvals. And then finally, the DBAs often will run some kind of script to gather or delete the information, depending on the kind of request. So I've almost never seen any, in fact, I don't think that I have ever seen a company that actually formally documented their identity process and their requirements for DSRs. They simply say, identify the person. There's no kind of standard that they're attempting to follow. They don't break it out by high or low risk. And a lot of times they simply ask for a driver's license or something like that, which, as we've seen, is not the best option. It's also very uncommon to see companies have any kind of procedure to validate a mailing address, because you are allowed to request this information on paper. So if you wanted to have some kind of access request sent to you and you didn't have access to that person's email address, you would be able to do that as well. So some of the challenges with this are, as we've seen, linking data to one individual person, especially where you can't require an account of that person. You can't necessarily require this to all be done behind an authentication sort of firewall. You're also not allowed to collect excessive information, so you're quite limited on both sides. This is really challenging, but you can't ask for excessive additional information, so you kind of have to work with what you've already got. Identification also can't be a burdensome process, because the law would say you're just doing this to prevent somebody from being able to exercise their rights. And even the gov.uk verify service is only 51% successful. And this is their own statistic. This is their own determination of how successful their program is. And if you collect identity documents, you're really only adding additional sensitive information that you have to protect. So the big takeaway for this, don't ask for identification. You do not need to see identification documents unless you already had that information. If you don't already have that information, what can you really know about a person's identity from just a passport or a driver's license? So there's really only two good methods. If you do have some kind of ID number, then you can ask for an actual scan of that identity document to show that that person is in possession of that document. The other option is, which is really the best option, is confirming information that is a shared transaction with that person. So to give you an example, this is the in-room breakfast card that was in my hotel room. it has somebody's name on it, and I know the room number already. So if I'm confirming with a person, I'm a hotel, somebody calls up and says, I want to get all of the information you have, here's my name, and I know it's my account because I'm this person and I stayed in this room at this date. So there's a lot of incidental data that's floating around that could be used to verify transaction history. So you want to make sure you're requesting at least 2 pieces of information that you wouldn't get at the same time. So maybe ask as well what the last 4 digits of the credit card on file might be, or some additional information like when you first created an account with the organization. Does anybody know what this is? The really weird pixel art here? Yeah? The Arecibo message. Yeah. So the Arecibo message is a really good example of how you would create a shared history between 2 entities. So whoever would be getting the Arecibo message doesn't necessarily know who we are and doesn't even really need to know who we are. We don't really need to know who they are. All we need to know is that there was a sender and a receiver. So there's shared history there, and that's how we would be able to say if we got this repeated back to us with a change, we would know then we have established some kind of communication. It's not really important who's on the other end. So when you're thinking about data subject requests, stop trying to think about who that person actually is. What you're trying to do is establish that that person is the same person who has that account history. So you're trying to connect data subjects to user records, not user records to real life people. So use a risk-based identity process. You can use graduated ID requirements. So low-risk data, don't ask for too much, but high-risk data, really make sure that that person can truly validate. You won't get in trouble if you reject requests. You should also assume that ID numbers are compromised, so you need to see the documents themselves. If somebody's trying to confirm just on social security number or passport number, these things are floating around all over the dark web. So we don't want to be giving out information where somebody's already probably having a very bad day. Also, you can follow the NIST digital identity guidelines. I've never seen anybody do this, but I think it would be a really good way to formalize a process. You can also minimize risk, especially for the automated DSRs, by adding things like a DSR UI banner if you have a pending request, so that user knows that their account has potentially been compromised. You should also be sending them emails or trying other forms of communication to let them know that there's been this request. Don't ever just let it happen in the background, especially don't ever tell them to ignore the warning signs of a compromise. And also use secure communication channels. Please don't make people email you passport photos. I will know, and I will come find you. Also, remember to campaign for 2FA and ask your product teams to, every once in a while run campaigns that are educational for users, because even if you offer it, sometimes it's hard to get users on board. So make it easy. Encourage account teams to really consider pushing for this with their users. So this is the photo slide. If you want to take this back to your company, these are the red flags that you're going to be looking for that would indicate you have a potential data subject attack. If somebody's requesting a mail copy to a new address, common names, especially names that have gone through a deduplication process, indirect identifiers, requests that aren't associated with an account or that can't give you any kind of account history, multiple associated names, similar requests, repeated text especially, so those boilerplate texts where you might see that somebody is attempting the same thing in multiple names. And then basically any unexplained increase in the number of data subject requests. If the volume goes up, then you should probably know why, and if you can't figure out why, then it might be malicious. So detection is very difficult for data subject requests, and we know that there's a black market for this type of data. It's not frequently used in any kind of pen test or red team review. There's very rarely anybody attempting to do this maliciously against their own company. So you probably wouldn't even know if your company was leaking data in this way, and it would be extremely difficult to trace back. So just keep in mind that you are absolutely allowed to reject data subject requests. You don't have to worry about telling somebody no. You have every legal right to deny a request if you can't prove that it's valid, and you can't positively identify that data subject. So all you have to do is document the reason so that you can support it and let that person know where they could escalate with a complaint. If it's a valid user, then they'll just escalate and you can say, okay, great, thanks, sorry about that, here's your data. The regulators will be able to sort it out. So if you're rejecting requests, there are a few different legal reasons that you're allowed to do this. At the end, there's a link to a GitHub that has all of the legal text that's associated with your reasons that you can reject a request, along with the legal rights that you would be able to potentially exploit. So there's a list of every legal reference, so you don't have to bother sorting through the entire text. And that's available for both GDPR and CCPA. So you can reject anything that's repetitive or potentially abusive, unconfirmed identities, data that you can't associate very clearly with one record. The law also allows you to reject any kind of request that would be what it considers impossible or requiring disproportionate effort. So there are areas where you don't really have to spend $140,000 fulfilling some of these rights. Also, you can reject a request if it looks like it would potentially affect anybody else as well. So to wrap this up, we really need security people. We need security people who can think creatively about how to break privacy processes. Privacy has been a legal thing for so long that it's completely bifurcated now. And you guys probably don't get much visibility about what your privacy teams are doing at all. And privacy teams really don't tend to ask for a lot of help from security, even though they should. So you can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security, including the security people. So, any questions about this content? Yeah? Can somebody tell me what the... So the question is there a new privacy guideline that's coming out? Or the NIST, you're talking about the NIST privacy framework? Yep. Yeah, that's an excellent one. It's not quite ready for prime time yet. They're still doing review on it, but be watching for the NIST privacy framework that will be coming out, which is going to be an excellent addition to this. Any other questions? Yeah. Sorry? Oh, why does Twitter think I'm a man? Because of my activity. Because I have male interests. Any other questions? Yeah, the states are passing some really interesting laws, especially the data broker law that came out. I think that's going to be really helpful. Also, I want to draw your attention, it's not a law, but I want to draw your attention to something really exciting that Apple did recently. They just released an ad attribution. It's basically adding a middleman that would prevent advertising organizations from tracking users individually for click-through rates. It would prevent them from associating it with any real person. So watch for that. It's pretty exciting. Colorado also just did some more privacy work as well. Any other questions? No? All right. So if you want to look at the cheat sheet, then this GitHub link will provide that for you. You can also talk to me on Twitter. I love hearing about stories of privacy programs gone wrong. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming here so early in the morning.